I stayed silent for years, carrying the weight of what happened between us. The lies, the sickness, the nights I begged for help that never came. I'm finally telling the truth, but it may cost me everything. Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day. I went into labor, completely alone. It was 3 in the morning and my husband Charles, my supposed partner, wouldn't even pick up his phone. 6 hours of silence. Do you know how it feels to be begging your own husband to just answer while you're bringing his child into the world? And it wasn't the first time. Oh no. This was strike 3. The first was when I thought I was losing the baby at 10 weeks, bleeding on the bathroom floor, sobbing, and he was nowhere. The second? When my dad had a heart attack. I needed someone to drive me to the hospital. Charles didn't show up then either. And now, when our daughter was about to take her first breath, I was alone again. When I finally got home from the hospital, exhausted, raw, and holding our newborn, he was passed out on the couch, needle still in his arm. Our daughter crying for food. Can you imagine the rage boiling in me? I shook him awake, told him flat out, get clean or get out. And that's when he grabbed my hands. His eyes locked on mine with this desperate, glassy sincerity. He swore that when I got sick, when I got old, when I needed him most, he would be there for me, just like I'd been there for him. He said that's what marriage really meant. And in that moment, part of me wanted so badly to believe him. And for a while, it looked like maybe, just maybe, he meant it. 6 months of AA meetings. A job at his uncle's warehouse. Night feedings with our daughter so I could actually sleep for once. He even bragged about me at his meetings, called me his angel, said he owed me his entire life. I went with him one Tuesday and he held my hand the whole time. For a second, I thought we'd finally turned a corner. But you know how it goes. The cracks always start small. He missed my birthday because of a work event. Later, I learned it wasn't even mandatory. Then came our anniversary, he forgot entirely. When I brought it up, he told me, you shouldn't need a special date to know I love you. Cute, right? When I got promoted to charge nurse, he sulked for days. Threw little digs about how nice it must be to have the time for career advancement while he was stuck in recovery. Then I heard through a friend what he'd been saying at meetings. That I was controlling. That I held his addiction over his head. That I was basically his warden. Meanwhile, I hadn't touched his phone or questioned his whereabouts in months. I was giving him freedom, and somehow that turned into ammunition. And then, when I got the flu that winter, he didn't even bother sleeping next to me. Said he couldn't risk missing work. No soup. No meds. Not even a glass of water. I brought it up after I recovered and he called me dramatic. Fast forward to the night I found a lump in my breast. I was in the shower and the second my fingers brushed over it, my whole body went cold. I stumbled out, called for him, he didn't hear me. Too busy with his video games and headphones. I booked the biopsy myself, reminded him 3 separate times about the appointment. And guess what? He still forgot. Claimed he had to work. Stage 2 breast cancer. That was my reality. And Charles? He went pale and muttered that medical stuff triggered his recovery. Do you know what it feels like to need your spouse more than ever and be told, sorry, too triggering? I swallowed my rage and said I understood. But inside it was like swallowing glass. My mother moved in the very next week. No discussion. She just showed up and became my rock. She drove me to every chemo session. Sat by my side. Held me when I couldn't stand. Charles? He always had somewhere else to be. Always had an excuse. But you better believe I still wore my wedding ring. Through every appointment, through the swelling, through the hair loss. The same ring I wore during his entire rehab when I worked overtime just to pay for it. 8 months of absolute hell. But I made it. I survived. And Charles? He threw a party. Balloons, banners, Instagram posts about his warrior wife. You'd think he was husband of the year. Except in reality, he came to 2 appointments. 2. And both times he sat in the waiting room scrolling his phone. 3 years later, I'd almost forgotten the sound of his old promises. Then the phone rang at 2 a.m. county jail. Charles had relapsed, gotten a DUI, and totaled our car. His voice slurred on the line as he begged me to bail him out. And then, oh, this part still makes me laugh, he actually said, you know I was there for your cancer. And I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a cruel one. A real, genuine laugh. Because the audacity? Almost comedic. I told him, you were there for Instagram. My mother was there for cancer. And I hung up. Rolled over. Went back to sleep beside my new husband, the oncology nurse who used to hold my hair back while I vomited during chemo. Charles hit rock bottom fast. He lost his job. Then his apartment. Even his own parents refused to take him in, because he'd already stolen from them before. The last update I got? He was crashing at the same homeless shelter where I used to volunteer during his first rehab. And here's the sickest part, the bed he sleeps in now might literally be one I made with my own hands, back when I thought I was helping him build a better future. And for a while, I told myself I didn't care. That walking away was the right thing to do. But then came the call. It was his lawyer. A woman I didn't even know existed. Apparently, Charles had been preparing for this moment for years. He'd been quietly building a case against me, documenting my so-called abuse. Screenshots, recordings, little twisted versions of every fight we'd ever had. 3 days later, I'm sitting across from Rachel Torres in her sleek downtown office. She's got this smug leather folder in front of her, thicker than a damn phone book. And she takes her sweet time opening it, like she's about to serve me a gourmet meal. Then page by page, she starts laying out evidence across the conference table. The first page? A screenshot from 2 years ago, me texting Charles that if he missed Emma's birthday I'd never forgive him. The word never was highlighted in neon yellow, like it was some smoking gun. The next page? An audio transcript from an AA meeting where Charles whined that I'd threatened to take Emma away if he relapsed. Someone had even recorded it. And it didn't stop there. Page after page after page slid across the table, while Rachel narrated this twisted story about me being emotionally abusive, manipulative, alienating Emma from her dad. She painted Charles like some kind of heroic father just trying to get his daughter back. By the time she was done, half the table was buried under papers. And she smiled when she told me this was just the highlights, from 147 pages total. Then she slid a custody petition across the table. Full physical custody for Charles. Me? Supervised visits twice a month. And to top it off? A demand for $3,000 in spousal support every single month because apparently his unemployment was my fault, trauma from our marriage. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even pick up the papers. Rachel calmly told me I had 10 days to respond. But if I wanted to settle, Charles would accept joint custody, if I agreed to pay him support. I walked out of that office on legs that barely worked. Made it to my car before I threw up in the parking garage. The only person I could call was Evan. He heard me sobbing before I could even get words out. He dropped everything, left the hospital mid-shift even though it meant getting written up. And we sat in that cold garage for 3 hours with Emma sleeping in her car seat while we scrolled through every single page on my phone. Evan kept pointing out the dates, showing me how Charles had been collecting this garbage while I was literally paying for his rehab. That night I didn't sleep. Not 1 minute. I kept replaying every fight Charles and I had ever had, wondering, was I controlling? Was I cruel? Did I somehow not see it? Evan held me close, but he didn't lie. He didn't say it'll be okay, because we both knew it might not. The next morning I emptied Emma's college fund. 3 years of savings, $12,000, gone in a single check. I handed it to David Brennan, one of the best custody attorneys in the state, the guy people whispered about when addiction cases got ugly. He spent 2 hours going through Charles's so-called evidence, scribbling notes. Then he looked up and said the words I'd been dreading. The bad news? Family courts love a redemption story. The good news? Charles's documentation reeks of manipulation. But don't fool yourself, judges don't always see it that way. His advice? Document everything from here on out. And file for emergency custody before Charles pulled another stunt. And wouldn't you know it, 5 days later the daycare called. Charles showed up claiming it was his visitation day. Visitation that didn't even exist yet. Emma was in tears, clinging to her teacher, while Charles told her mommy wouldn't let him see her. The director called the cops, but Charles bolted before they arrived. That night he posted a Facebook photo of himself crying outside the daycare. Captioned it, being denied the right to see my daughter. Within days there were over 300 comments. Strangers calling me a monster. Friends of friends saying I was heartless. Meanwhile, my mom flew in from Florida with a cardboard box she'd been hiding in her garage. Inside? Every appointment card from my chemo. Parking receipts from 47 hospital visits. Photos of her holding my hand during treatment. Charles was nowhere in sight in a single one. She looked me in the eye and said, I kept these because I knew this day might come. At the emergency hearing, Judge Hoffman barely even glanced at my evidence. Instead, she spent 20 minutes praising Charles. His dedication to recovery, his commitment to rebuilding a relationship with his daughter. She gave him supervised visitation every Saturday at a court center and said she was impressed by his sobriety. When Brennan brought up how he abandoned me during chemo, she waved it off. Addiction is a disease, she said. We don't punish people for being sick. The first supervised visit? A disaster. The supervisor's report noted that Charles told Emma, Daddy was very sick, but Mommy wouldn't help him get better. It was marked concerning, but apparently not bad enough to restrict access. Emma came home asking me, why didn't you help Daddy when he was sick? As if that wasn't enough, Charles started attending a brand new AA group across town, one where nobody knew his real history. And there, he spun his tale, how I had weaponized his addiction, used it to keep his daughter away. Within weeks, 3 members had written glowing character letters to his lawyer about what a devoted father he was and how cruel I'd been. That night, Evan found me sobbing in the kitchen. He didn't try to talk me out of my anger. He just pulled out a yellow legal pad and said, we start now. We write everything down. The very next morning, we went to Target and bought a thick notebook with a lock. Every single text from Charles got printed, taped inside, dated. Every pickup, every drop-off, every word Emma said about him, we logged it all. Evan even started taking before and after photos of Emma, her neat little braids in the morning versus the tangled mess when she came home, still in the same clothes. That notebook filled up in weeks. We bought another. Then Brennan tried to subpoena Charles's records from his original AA group, the one where people actually knew the truth. But the leader refused, citing confidentiality. Even with a subpoena, we couldn't get them. So Brennan filed for a court order, which meant 6 more weeks of waiting and another $3,000 in legal fees. Mediation came next. Beige conference room, stale coffee smell. Charles shows up in a brand new suit, Rachel at his side. And when the mediator asks for his side, he bursts into tears. Actual sobbing. He says I never supported his recovery, that my coldness triggered his relapse. Rachel pulls out a letter from some therapist I've never even heard of, claiming Charles has PTSD from our toxic marriage and needs custody for stability. The mediator nods along like it's gospel. When it's my turn, I get about 2 minutes before she cuts me off. Says we need to focus on the future, not the past. She suggests a visitation plan that would gradually build to 50-50 custody within 6 months. I try to bring up how he abandoned me during chemo. She actually says, past medical issues shouldn't prevent a parent from building a future relationship. Brennan kicks me under the table to shut me up. But then Hope, Dr. Vasquez, my oncologist, calls me directly after my mom fills her in. She's furious when she hears what's happening. She offers to testify about all the times I showed up to chemo alone, sick, shaking, sometimes vomiting in the parking lot. She even has notes in my medical file about my lack of support system. She tells me, I'll say it under oath. And just when I start to breathe again, I get a Facebook message from Tommy, Charles's uncle, the one who gave him a job at the warehouse. He confesses that Charles wasn't working overtime during my cancer like he'd claimed. No, he was getting high in the bathroom. Tommy even drove him home once when he was too out of it to stand. He says he'll testify if needed, even though family is complicated. Rachel must have caught wind, because the very next day she filed a motion to block Dr. Vasquez's testimony. Said it was irrelevant, prejudicial against a parent in recovery. Then she demanded all my medical records to prove I was fit to care for Emma. Brennan said it was a scare tactic, but I was still ready to scream. Meanwhile, Emma started waking up from nightmares, clinging to me, begging not to go with Charles. I recorded it. Wrote it all down. But when Charles found out, he accused me of coaching her. Demanded she be evaluated by a child psychologist. The court-appointed doctor, Jennifer Mills, scheduled 2 sessions. One with me, one with him. Emma played happily with blocks in my session, chatting about preschool. But during Charles's? She clung to him, silent, even when he pulled out a whole bag of new toys like some bargain bin Santa. Dr. Mills just scribbled notes. Said nothing. And that's where we're stuck, me fighting with notebooks, witnesses, and the truth, while Charles keeps rewriting history. Meanwhile, Brennan had been digging deeper into Charles's finances. And oh, did he find something? Turns out Charles hadn't filed taxes in 3 years. He owed the IRS $47,000. And remember how he'd been telling everyone he had steady work? Yeah, total lie. So we bring this up in court, thinking it's damning evidence, right? But Rachel, his slick little attorney, stood there with a straight face and argued that his tax evasion was actually, wait for it, the result of his disease of addiction. She literally called not paying taxes a medical condition. I almost laughed out loud right there in the courtroom. 3 weeks later, we're back in front of Judge Hoffman. And for the first time, she looks uneasy, because Jennifer, the court-appointed psychologist, wrote something in her report about Emma having nightmares after her visits with Charles. But instead of seeing that as a red flag against him, Judge Hoffman suggested the nightmares might be signs of parental alienation. And her solution? Force me and Charles into joint family therapy sessions. Now, I knew exactly how this would go. Charles had run this play before. He sat there in therapy, voice so soft the therapist had to lean in to hear him, spinning this sob story about accountability and healing. Then came the crocodile tears, about how he just wanted to be a good dad, and I was the one holding him back with all my old resentments. And you know what? The therapist nodded along like she was watching some tragic movie. When I tried to bring up the stolen money, or the times he abandoned me during emergencies, she immediately redirected the session to forgiveness and moving forward for Emma's sake. I walked out of that office, locked myself in my bathroom, and sobbed harder than I had since chemo. Evan sat on the other side of the door, reminding me that we still had the truth and evidence, even if no one seemed willing to see it yet. The next week, my mom ran into Charles outside the courthouse and finally lost it. She called him exactly what he was, a pathological liar and a junkie. Rachel wasted no time spinning it, filed for a restraining order that same afternoon, claiming my mother was harassing a recovering addict who was just trying to be a father. 2 days later, Jennifer's preliminary report came out. And it was worse than I'd imagined. She wrote that both parents were capable, but flagged my resistance to co-parenting as a problem. Her recommendation? Increase Charles's visitation. Not just supervised visits, but unsupervised afternoons twice a week. Starting immediately. Brennan told me we could appeal, but warned that fighting it would only make me look even more resistant. So we had to swallow it and keep documenting. That week, I scrambled to line up nurses from the oncology ward, the ones who saw Charles stumble and high during my chemo treatments. 3 agreed at first, ready to write affidavits. But then hospital legal stepped in, warning them that getting involved in my custody case could jeopardize their jobs. 2 backed out instantly. The 3rd ghosted. Emma's first unsupervised visit was supposed to be a trip to the park. Cute, right? But she came home covered in chocolate, dress ruined, rambling about a house with lots of people where daddy's friends gave her candy. When Brennan pressed Charles in court, he brushed it off, said kids make things up. And unbelievably, Jennifer's notes implied I might be coaching Emma to say bad things. So I downloaded a recording app on my phone. And at the very next pickup, I caught Charles on tape telling Emma that Evan wasn't her real family, and that real families don't have 2 daddies. Brennan said it was good evidence, but thanks to Wisconsin's 2-party consent laws, using it could actually backfire. If the court saw it as spying, it could paint me as the manipulative one. Then Tommy, Charles's uncle, finally snapped. He called me after Charles showed up at the warehouse drunk, threatening him for betraying family by not siding with him in court. Tommy promised he'd testify. He even sent employment records proving Charles had been fired for stealing tools and selling them, something he'd been lying about for months, pretending it was a layoff. Meanwhile at home, Emma was asking questions no toddler should have to ask. One night during bath time, she looked up at me with those big brown eyes and asked why Daddy said I was mean when he loved me so much. I sat on that bathroom floor, scrambling for words. How do you explain addiction and manipulation to a 3-year-old without turning her father into a monster? The court therapist had drilled into me, never disparage the other parent. So I swallowed my rage and told Emma that sometimes grown-ups just have different ideas about things. Then I dried her off with her favorite dinosaur towel and tucked her into bed. Next therapy session? Charles accused me of poisoning his whole family against him. Said that's why Tommy was testifying for me. The therapist just nodded and scribbled notes about competitive parenting, while Charles spun his tale and Emma sat between us, coloring flowers. I wanted to scream that Tommy had called me, after Charles stole $800 from his truck. But instead I just sat there watching Emma's crayons scratch across the page. Rachel struck again, sending over a mountain of paperwork demanding every single work schedule I'd had for the last 5 years. She highlighted every 12-hour shift, every weekend I'd worked, and wrote in the margins, absent mothers lose custody. Talk about playing chess while your opponent just flips the board over and calls it strategy. Brennan pointed out that I'd worked those brutal shifts to pay for Charles's third rehab. Rachel smirked and said it was irrelevant. Then Dr. Vasquez, my oncologist, my lifeline, took the stand. She brought a binder stacked with appointment cards, Uber receipts, photos of me sleeping in chemo chairs alone. She testified for 2 straight hours, describing exactly how I fought cancer with no one by my side. And for once I thought maybe, just maybe, the court would see the truth. But then Charles paraded in his new AA sponsor. This man testified for 40 minutes straight about how Charles was the most dedicated person in recovery he'd ever met. He gushed about Charles's honesty, his commitment, his growth. The judge sat there nodding like it was gospel. The sponsor had no clue about the needles, the lies, the theft. None of it. At the next exchange, Charles bent down to tie Emma's shoe and something slipped out of his jacket pocket. It looked exactly like a needle. He snatched it up fast, shoved it back in, and mumbled that it was an EpiPen for a peanut allergy he'd magically developed. Emma saw it though. "What's the pointy thing, Daddy?" she asked. He fumbled with excuses, but I snapped a few photos. Brennan filed for immediate drug testing. Rachel went nuclear, accused us of harassing a recovering addict and threatened complaints with the state bar. She even compared drug testing Charles to making a cancer patient prove they weren't faking. And the judge? Actually seemed to consider it. In the end, she ordered both of us to test within 24 hours. Charles came back clean. And suddenly, I looked like the paranoid, vindictive ex-wife trying to frame him. That night, Tommy called me crying. Charles had bragged about carrying fake urine for weeks, just in case. Tommy didn't know what to do anymore. And then Charles doubled down, filed emergency papers claiming I was mentally unstable from PTSD, saying my cancer treatments had made me see danger everywhere. He wanted Emma permanently, with me reduced to supervised visits once a month. His claim? That my false accusations were damaging Emma's relationship with her father. The very next day, my oncology unit went to war for me. 5 nurses. 2 doctors. All offering to testify. The judge only allowed 1 witness, Dr. Vasquez again, but I'll never forget the others, ready to stand up for me. 10 weeks into this nightmare, Emma came home from daycare with a picture she'd drawn. It was me, her, and Evan, all holding hands under a rainbow. Her teacher told me she asked where her daddy was. Emma said, "He's at the place with the strangers where everyone sits in a circle and talks about being sad." And just when I thought I'd seen it all, Brennan called me into his office. On his laptop was something that made my stomach drop. Charles had been recording our phone calls for months and editing them. One file was from the night Emma was sick with the flu. I'd worked a 12-hour shift and begged Charles 3 times to pick her up from daycare. But he'd cut that part out. All that remained was my exhausted voice saying 4 words, "You never helped me." Played back like a weapon, stripped of context. A digital forensics expert Brennan hired found 17 more edited recordings. She showed us the waveforms where Charles had literally spliced calls together to invent fake arguments. The worst one? From the night I got my mammogram results. I'd called him crying, terrified. He told me I was being dramatic about nothing. Charles edited it to sound like I was hysterical over Emma spilling juice on the carpet. The expert said she could prove the manipulation, but it would cost at least $10,000 more for a full forensic report and testimony. We were drowning already. But then Evan's parents showed up at our door. They handed me a check for $15,000. His mom held my hands and said they'd even started the paperwork to mortgage their house if we needed more. 2 people who'd only known me for 2 years were ready to risk their retirement. While Charles's own family, they'd already abandoned him. 3 months into the custody nightmare, the guardian ad litem met with Emma again at daycare. Later, her teacher pulled me aside, visibly shaken. Emma had grabbed a toy syringe from the doctor playset, jabbed it against her arm, and said something about Daddy's special medicine. The guardian's report? She brushed it off. Said kids often misinterpret adult behavior, and maybe Emma had seen Charles taking vitamins or allergy shots. Vitamins. Right. 2 weeks later, we had our first session with a court-appointed family counselor who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. Charles sat there for 20 minutes spinning this performance about how abandoned he felt during my cancer treatment. But here's the kicker, he suddenly remembered specific details about my chemo schedule. Dates he'd previously sworn he couldn't recall. The therapist caught it. She asked him point blank, if you never went to her treatments, how did you know she had them every 3rd Thursday? Charles stammered, muttered something about checking my calendar. She wrote it down. For once, someone else was catching the cracks. That night at 2 a.m., Evan shook me awake. There was a car idling outside our house. We peeked out the window. Charles's beat-up Honda sat across the street, headlights off, engine running, just watching. Evan called the police, but they shrugged it off. Without a restraining order, he has a right to drive by his child's home. The next morning, Tommy called Brennan's office. He had screenshots of texts from Charles sent 6 months earlier. In them, Charles bragged about documenting everything for a custody battle and actually joked that my cancer sob story wouldn't work anymore. His words, not mine. Her stupid cancer card won't work in court. Rachel tried to get the messages thrown out, said Tommy was biased because Charles had stolen tools from him. But the judge allowed them in with a warning to the jury to consider the source. 4 weeks later, Brennan received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a flash drive. On it, AA meeting recordings from 2 years back. And in 3 separate sessions, Charles openly admitted he'd been using during my chemo. He bragged about planning to take Emma from me as payback for kicking him out. The audio was crystal clear, time-stamped, and legally recorded. Charles himself had signed consent forms for the group archives. That same afternoon, Emma's play therapist called. She said Emma had acted out a scene with dolls, Daddy giving himself shots in the bathroom while telling the mommy doll she was mean and crazy. The therapist documented every detail and reported it immediately. The next morning, Brennan filed a motion to admit the AA recordings. Rachel nearly lost her mind in court, shouting about confidentiality. But the judge reminded her, Charles was the one who brought AA witnesses in the first place. He'd opened that door himself. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. When the forensics expert presented his analysis, it was devastating. He showed the judge side-by-side comparisons of the original recordings versus Charles's edited versions. In the originals, I was begging him to get help for Emma's sake. In Charles's doctored tapes, it sounded like I was threatening him. The expert even pointed out the spliced waveforms, where Charles had literally pieced different conversations together. Rachel tried to call it differences in perspective, but even she looked rattled. Meanwhile, the visitation monitor filed her latest report, and it made my blood boil. Charles had been peppering Emma with questions about Evan during visits. Does he yell at Mommy? Are you scared of him? Emma, bless her heart, ignored him and told the monitor about the butterflies Evan was teaching her to paint on her bedroom wall. 4 months into the proceedings, Jennifer, the guardian ad litem, finally submitted her full report. She recommended Emma stay in therapy and flagged concerning patterns in Charles's behavior. Her conclusion? Visitation should remain supervised. When she read it aloud in court, Charles snapped. He stood up, yelling that I'd poisoned everyone against him, even his own daughter. The bailiff stepped forward. Charles sat down, but everyone had seen the mask slip. Judge Hoffman looked troubled, said she was deeply concerned, but still reminded the court that recovery deserved compassion. 2 days later, my phone rang at midnight. County jail again. Charles had gotten another DUI. His blood alcohol? 0.18, and when they pulled him over, guess what was in the back seat? Emma's car seat. She wasn't with him, thank God. But the thought alone made me sick. The very next morning, Rachel withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. Translation, even she couldn't stomach defending him anymore. Charles scrambled, and the only lawyer he could get was a baby-faced public defender who looked barely out of high school. Once his visits were suspended because of the DUI, something incredible happened. Emma finally started sleeping through the night again. No more nightmares. She stopped asking about Daddy's medicine. She laughed at bedtime when Evan read her stories. My little girl finally looked like herself again. Of course, Charles wasn't done. He showed up at the hospital during one of my shifts, screaming in the ER lobby that I'd set him up. He was drunk. Security dragged him out while he shouted that I'd ruined his life. The hospital banned him and filed a police report. After that, my mom started spotting his Honda parked at the end of our street night after night. She took photos, time-stamped, date-stamped, kept them in a folder. One night, she even walked up to his car and knocked on the window. He sped off before she could say a word. We filed for a restraining order. The judge denied it. Said parking on a public street wasn't harassment. But then, finally, a breakthrough. The AA recordings were admitted as evidence. I sat in court listening to Charles's own voice, laughing about how he'd played me during my cancer treatments, how he knew exactly what he was doing when he stayed away. The judge's face changed when she heard him. For the first time, she looked like she truly saw him. And then? The shocker of all shockers. Charles's own parents called my lawyer. They wanted to testify. They drove up from Florida with boxes of bank statements and receipts showing how Charles had stolen their credit cards, pawned their jewelry. His mother cried as she showed me the pawn slip for her mother's wedding ring, dated 2 days after my very first chemo treatment. The guardian ad litem interviewed Emma 3 more times after that. Each time, Emma parroted phrases that didn't sound like a child. And when Jennifer asked where she learned them, Emma said Daddy had taught her what to say about Mommy being mean. Jennifer's final recommendation? Supervised visits only, with a professional monitor present at all times. And then, for the first time in a long time, life gave me a glimpse of normal. Evan took me to Emma's dance recital. She twirled in her little pink tutu to some Disney song. And the entire time? She never once looked around for her dad. 2 weeks later, Tommy called me again, panicked. He'd found packages at the warehouse addressed to fake names. Security footage showed Charles using a copied key to sneak in after hours and pick them up. They traced back to a shady online pharmacy selling pills without prescriptions. Tommy turned everything over to the police and to Brennan. Meanwhile, Charles's DUI case moved forward. His public defender got him to plead no contest. The judge handed down 2 years probation and 90 days in rehab, or 6 months in county jail if he failed. Brennan told me this would only help us in family court. Proof of ongoing substance abuse. But the rabbit hole kept going. During discovery, Brennan's assistant found files on Charles's seized computer. He'd been posting on divorced dads forums under fake names, detailing our exact situation, asking for tips on beating the system. People told him to cry parental alienation, to document me constantly. One post even suggested he hurt himself and blame me. Brennan printed over 200 pages. In some, Charles admitted outright he was still using, just needed to look clean long enough to win custody. And then rehab imploded. He failed 3 drug tests in his first month. Staff found pills stashed in his room. He was caught trying to buy off another patient. They kicked him out on the spot. Automatic probation violation. The criminal judge issued a bench warrant. Family court called both lawyers into chambers. Judge Hoffman sat for 2 hours reviewing the AA recordings, Tommy's evidence, the forum posts. When she came out, her face looked pale. She said she needed time to process such serious allegations. But in the meantime, Charles's visitation was officially suspended. 6 long months crawled by. Depositions, hearings, endless paperwork. And finally we reached the actual custody trial. Charles walked into that courtroom looking like a ghost of himself. Thinner by at least 30 pounds. His suit hung off him like he'd borrowed it from someone bigger. His new lawyer stood up and gave the same tired speech I'd heard 100 times. Addiction is a disease. Charles deserves one more chance, mercy, redemption. I watched the judge jot notes while Brennan calmly shuffled her papers, waiting for her turn to strike. Dr. Vasquez took the stand first. She told the court about the time she found me checking myself out against medical advice after chemo, just so I could get home to Emma. She described finding me passed out in the hospital bathroom, exhausted, dehydrated, because I was caring for a toddler while poison pumped through my veins. Charles kept his head down, but I saw his hands shaking on the table. Next came his parents. His mother's voice cracked as she described finding him unconscious in their bathroom during my 3rd round of chemo. She'd gone in to grab my pain meds they were holding for me, only to find the bottle empty beside his body. Paramedics had to hit him with Narcan twice to bring him back, while I was at home puking from chemo and trying to distract a toddler with coloring books. Then Brennan laid out Tommy's timeline, the spliced recordings, the forensics. The IT expert showed exactly how Charles had pieced conversations together, turning my begging into threats, turning his rage into mine. Objection after objection, but the judge allowed it all. Finally, Charles himself took the stand. And that's when it all unraveled. Under questioning, he admitted he'd been using through my entire cancer treatment. Swore he was different now. Brennan asked him flat out if he was sober today. He said yes. But his pupils were blown wide and he couldn't stop wiping his nose. She pressed again. He broke. Started crying. Admitted he'd used that morning just to calm his nerves for court. The judge's face went stone cold. She called a recess. Out in the hallway, Charles's mother came up to me with tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my hands and whispered she should have spoken up sooner, but she'd been terrified of losing her son. She apologized for everything. Said she understood if I never wanted them in my life again. When court resumed, Charles's probation officer testified. Confirmed the positive drug test. Confirmed the violation. Then Emma's therapist submitted her report, how the supervised visits triggered nightmares, how Emma wet the bed after seeing him, how she bloomed again once visits stopped. The evidence spoke for itself. On the final day, Brennan delivered closing arguments like a scalpel cutting through lies. She laid out the years of deliberate choices, the pattern of manipulation, the danger. She pointed to the board covered in timelines, records, police reports, and told the judge to see the truth staring her in the face. Charles's lawyer shuffled papers, muttered about recovery and second chances, his voice trailing off like he knew he was losing. The judge didn't even look up. Then it was over. The judge lowered her pen and stared at Charles. She said in all her years she'd rarely seen deception this calculated. She said he weaponized recovery, weaponized his disease, used it as a shield while he sabotaged his own family. She granted me sole legal and physical custody. No visitation. Not unless Charles completed treatment and stayed sober for a full year with verified testing. Charles leapt up, chair crashing behind him. He screamed that I'd destroyed his life, stolen his daughter, poisoned everyone against him. Called me words I won't repeat. The bailiff moved in, the gavel came down, and he was held in contempt. Minutes later, his probation officer confirmed more violations, missed drug tests, failed tests, and Charles was arrested right there in the courtroom. Outside, Brennan told me the ruling was ironclad. No appeals for at least a year. My mom and Evan flanked me in the parking lot. We didn't cheer. We didn't smile. We were too wrung out for celebration. Just relief. A week later, Emma asked about her daddy while coloring rainbows at the kitchen table. I told her he was sick and he needed to get better just like Mommy did with cancer. She nodded, went back to her crayons. Then came the legal bill, $47,000. Evan and I sat at the kitchen table, building a payment plan that would take 5 years. We looked at each other and agreed, it was worth every penny for Emma's safety. Charles's mother showed up that weekend with a birthday gift for Emma and a box of old photos of Charles as a child. She told me she'd support whatever boundaries we needed, separate from her son. She understood. Tommy called 2 weeks later. Charles was in a state-run facility after jail. Getting treatment. But Tommy didn't sound hopeful. 3 months later, I testified at his probation hearing. And for the first time, I told the whole story unfiltered. The bathroom floor. The missed emergencies. The needles. The promises that meant nothing. I said it all. The judge sentenced him to 6 months in jail and mandatory inpatient treatment. And then looked me in the eye and told me I was brave for protecting Emma. 2 weeks later, Jennifer made her last home visit. She smiled as she watched Emma play. No nightmares. Eating well. Laughing with friends. A healthy 4-year-old finally. I went back to work full-time. My supervisor told me I looked like the nurse she'd hired 5 years ago, not the ghost I'd become. Evan and I started couples therapy. We realized how much of our energy had gone into surviving Charles's chaos instead of living. Then came the letter. Charles's lawyer wrote that he wouldn't fight the custody decision. He was focusing on his recovery. Emma's name wasn't even mentioned once. By September, Emma started preschool at the little building with the bright yellow door. That first morning I braced for tears. But she grabbed her backpack, ran to the dress-up corner and slipped on a princess crown. She didn't look back. The teacher had to gently suggest I could probably leave now. That afternoon I took off my old wedding ring, the ring I'd worn through hell, and sold it. $800. The first deposit into Emma's college fund. Rebuilding what we lost. My mom flew home after 6 months with us. At the airport she hugged me tight and whispered I was a better mother than she'd ever been, because I actually protected my child. In October I spoke at a nursing conference about recognizing abuse patterns in healthcare. I stood on stage in front of 300 nurses and told them about the bathroom floor, the chemo, the documentation, the lies. Not one person looked at their phone for 20 minutes. And tonight, as I stand in Emma's doorway with Evan, watching her sleep with her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Peace. The court orders are filed away. The promises Charles made are just echoes now. And for the first time I can say it without doubt, we won. Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.